Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, I want you to do me a favor. Dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, and just let your brain settle into the floorboards. We're going to spend a very long, very quiet time tonight talking about two people who were essentially professional wallflowers. We're talking about Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Now, if you're expecting a high-octane romance with horse chases and scandalous duels, you've wandered into the wrong library. This is a story about two people who spent the better part of their lives being intensely sickly, writing incredibly long poems that nobody, and I mean nobody, actually understood, and obsessively overthinking their own feelings. It's the ultimate Victorian slow burn. And by slow, I mean glacially slow. So let's just float into the damp, foggy streets of 1840s London and meet our first protagonist, Elizabeth. Elizabeth Barrett was, by all accounts, a bit of a literal ghost. She lived at 50 Wimpole Street, which sounds like a place where fun goes to die. And in her case, that was pretty accurate. She was the eldest of 12 children. Yes, 12. Because back then, having a dozen children was just what you did when you were bored and wealthy. But Elizabeth wasn't running around the garden. She spent most of her time in a darkened room, lying on a sofa, surrounded by books and the smell of laudanum. She had this mysterious spinal injury or nervous collapse. Historians are still arguing about what was actually wrong with her, but mostly she was just suffering from a severe case of having a terrifying father. Edward Moulton Barrett was the kind of dad who didn't just disapprove of his children getting married, he basically forbade it as if he were a villain in a low-budget Gothic novel. He wanted his children to stay in the house forever, like a collection of very quiet, very sad porcelain dolls. And Elizabeth, being the most famous and talented of the bunch, was his prize doll. She was already a literary celebrity by her 30s, which was impressive, considering she barely ever left her room. She was tiny, she was pale, and she had these massive, dark eyes that looked like they had seen the end of the world and found it mildly disappointing. She had a dog named Flush, a golden spaniel who was probably the only creature allowed to see her on a regular basis. Imagine being a world-famous poet and your best friend is a dog who spends most of his time trying to bite your suitors. It was a vibe. And then there was Robert. Now, Robert Browning was a choice. In 1844, he was 32 years old, living with his parents because, of course, he was, and his career was, to put it gently, in the toilet. He had published these massive, dense poems like Sordello, which were so incomprehensible that even his friends told him to maybe try prose, or perhaps a different hobby entirely. One critic famously said he read the first line and the last line and understood neither. Robert was energetic, he was loud, and he had a habit of talking over people. But beneath all that, he was a total fanboy. He read Elizabeth's poems in 1844, and instead of just sending a polite good job note, he decided to write her a letter that basically said, "I love your verses with all my heart, and I love you too." Which is, let's be honest, a bit much for a first DM. Elizabeth, who was used to being praised for her intellect but ignored as a human woman, was understandably rattled. She wrote back and thus began one of the most exhaustive, wordy, and frankly exhausting correspondences in the history of literature. They wrote hundreds of letters before they even met. They talked about Greek verbs, they talked about their headaches, they talked about how much they hated the weather. It was the 19th century equivalent of two people texting 24/7 because they're both too socially anxious to actually hang out. Robert kept asking to visit, and Elizabeth kept making excuses. "I'm too ill," she'd say. "The room is too dark. My father is lurking in the hallway like a gargoyle." But Robert was persistent. He was the human version of a golden retriever who refuses to stop bringing you a tennis ball, even if you're currently in the middle of a funeral. Finally, in May 1845, she relented. He came to Wimpole Street, he climbed the stairs, he entered the darkened room where the air was thick with the scent of old paper and medicine, and there she was, the great poetess, looking like a very delicate bird that might shatter if he spoke too loudly. Did they fall in love instantly? Well, Robert certainly thought so. He went home and immediately wrote her another letter that was so intense that she actually sent it back to him and told him to burn it. She told him that his feelings were extravagant and that he shouldn't waste his time on a blind, deaf, and dumb invalid. She was leaning very hard into the "I'm a tragic mess" aesthetic. But Robert didn't care. He liked the mess. He decided that he was going to rescue her, whether she wanted to be rescued or not. For the next year, he visited her once or twice a week. They had to keep it a total secret from her father, which meant Robert had to time his arrivals and departures like he was pulling off a heist. If Edward Barrett had found out that a penniless, unsuccessful poet was sniffing around his favorite daughter, he probably would have had a literal meltdown. So they sat in that room, whispering about poetry and their souls, while the rest of the family walked on eggshells downstairs. It was a very quiet, very polite rebellion. Elizabeth started to get better, which is the most ironic part of the whole thing. The more she talked to Robert, the more she started to think, wait, maybe I don't have to stay in this bed until I die. She started taking walks. She even went to the park. Her father was confused, her brothers were suspicious, and Flush the dog was probably just happy to get some fresh air. But the tension was building. They knew they couldn't keep this up forever. Robert wanted to move to Italy because in the 19th century, Italy was the place you went if you were a poet, or if you had a cough, or if you were running away from your overbearing father. But Elizabeth was terrified. She was 40 years old. She had never lived anywhere else. She was addicted to laudanum, and she was convinced that if she left, her father would disown her and never speak her name. Spoilers, she was right about that last part. But Robert, in his typical, slightly annoying, very charming way, just kept pushing. He told her she was a star and a queen and that she deserved to breathe the air of the Mediterranean. So they hatched a plan. It wasn't a very good plan, but it was their plan. They were going to get married in secret, and then they were going to flee to the continent. It sounds romantic, doesn't it? But imagine two very nervous, very sickly intellectuals trying to organize a secret escape. It was less Ocean's 11 and more two librarians trying to sneak out of a silent study hall. On September 12, 1846, Elizabeth slipped out of the house with her maid, Wilson, and her dog, Flush. She met Robert at St. Marybone Parish Church. They got married in a ceremony that was so rushed and somber, it might as well have been a dental appointment. Afterward, Elizabeth went back home. Yes, she went back to her father's house and pretended nothing had happened for a whole week. She sat at dinner with her father, knowing she was now Mrs. Robert Browning, while he probably complained about the soup. The stress must have been astronomical. Finally, on September 19th, they made their move. They packed their bags, grabbed the dog, and headed for the docks. As they sailed away toward France, Elizabeth felt a mix of absolute terror and a weird new sensation that people call freedom. She had finally escaped the tomb of Wimpole Street. Let's just float over to their life in Italy because, as it turns out, being a runaway poet is actually a lot of work. They ended up in Florence at a place called Casa Guidi, and this is where the story gets really cozy if you like the idea of two people sitting in a big stone apartment surrounded by heavy furniture, writing poems for 8 hours a day. Their health improved, mostly because the sun was actually shining, and they weren't being psychologically tortured by a Victorian patriarch. Robert, however, had a bit of an ego problem. While Elizabeth's fame was skyrocketing, she was even considered for poet laureate, Robert's books were still being used as doorstops. He was Mr. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and while he claimed to be happy about it, you can imagine the slight sting of being the +1 at every literary salon in Florence. He spent a lot of time wandering the streets, looking at old paintings, and trying to figure out why his poems were so complicated. But they were happy in their own quiet, slightly dysfunctional way. They had a son whom they nicknamed Pen, short for Panini, which was his own toddler mispronunciation of his name. They raised him in a way that was frankly a bit weird. They let his hair grow long, they dressed him in velvet, and they treated him like a tiny living work of art. Penn grew up to be a bit of a disappointment, as most children of geniuses do, but for a while he was the center of their little, self-contained world. Elizabeth became obsessed with spiritualism, which was a huge trend back then. She spent a lot of time at seances, trying to talk to ghosts. Robert hated it. He thought it was all a scam, and he once famously got into a fight with a medium named Daniel Douglas Home because he caught him using his foot to make a spirit tap on the table. It was the only thing they ever really fought about. Elizabeth wanted to believe in the afterlife, and Robert wanted to believe in cold, hard reality. But as the years went on, Elizabeth's health began to fail again. The Italian cure could only do so much for a body that had been fueled by opium and isolation for decades. She died in Robert's arms in 1861. Her last word was beautiful, which is a very on-brand thing for a poet to say. Robert was devastated. He left Italy and never went back to Florence. He moved back to London, became a social butterfly, and finally became famous in his own right. He spent his final decades being the grand old man of English poetry, dining out every night and talking about his late wife to anyone who would listen. He died in Venice in 1889, on the same day his last book was published. So that's the story of the Brownings. Two people who found each other through the mail, escaped a nightmare house, and spent their lives trying to turn their feelings into art. It's not a loud story. It's a story of whispers and ink stains and the quiet courage it takes to leave a dark room. I think we'll end part 1 here. Let the silence of Casa Guidi settle around you. And the next part, we'll dive into a completely different kind of royal disaster, one involving more crowns and significantly less poetry. But for now, just breathe. Everything is quiet. All right, let's leave the drafty rooms of Victorian London behind and drift a bit further back in time. We're going to cross the Channel, head south over the Pyrenees, and land ourselves in the stiff, suffocating court of 17th century Madrid. If you thought Elizabeth Barrett's father was a bit much, wait until you meet the Spanish Habsburgs. This is a family that took the concept of keeping it in the family to a level that was, frankly, a biological catastrophe. We're talking about Charles II of Spain. Now, Charles is often remembered as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, because, of course, back then, if a king was born with a list of medical issues longer than his royal cape, it couldn't possibly be because his parents were uncle and niece. No, it had to be a curse. It had to be sorcery, because why admit to poor genetic choices when you can just blame a disgruntled witch? Charles was born in 1661, and from the second he arrived, the Spanish court knew they were in for a long, slow decline. To understand Charles, you have to understand the Habsburg jaw. It was the family's signature look, a protruding lower mandible that grew more pronounced with every cousin marriage. By the time it got to Charles, his jaw was so oversized that his upper and lower teeth didn't actually meet. He couldn't chew his food, he drooled, he had a tongue so large that he could barely speak. He was the king of one of the most powerful empires on earth, and he essentially spent his life struggling to eat a piece of soft bread. But let's talk about the irony of his upbringing. Here was a child who was the pinnacle of European royalty, yet he was so fragile that he wasn't allowed to walk until he was almost 10 years old. His handlers were terrified he would literally break. They didn't even make him go to school or learn anything useful because they didn't want to strain his delicate brain. So Charles grew up wandering the cavernous, dark halls of the Alcazar Palace, surrounded by fawning courtiers and religious relics, without a single thought in his head other than perhaps wondering when the next meal he couldn't chew was coming. His mother, Mariana of Austria, ruled as regent. She was his father's niece, by the way, just keeping track. Mariana was determined to keep Charles safe, which mostly meant keeping him isolated and ignorant.
He was treated like a sacred breaking vase. He wasn't even washed very often because they thought water was dangerous for his constitution. Imagine the vibe of this court. A king who can't speak, who drools, who hasn't had a bath in weeks, sitting on a gold throne while people bow and scrape and call him His Catholic Majesty. It's the kind of absurdity that only history can provide. When it came time for Charles to marry, because the dynasty desperately needed an heir, despite the obvious signs that the genetic well had run dry, they chose Marie-Louise of Orleans. She was the niece of Louis XIV of France, and she was, by all accounts, beautiful, vibrant, and absolutely horrified to be sent to Spain. She arrived in Madrid to find a husband who looked like a half-baked Habsburg potato, as we might say today. He was pale, sickly, and had the emotional maturity of a toddler. The poor woman spent 10 years in the Spanish court, which was famous for being the most boring place in Europe. The etiquette was so strict that queens weren't allowed to look out of windows or talk to men. Marie-Louise became deeply depressed and dealt with it the only way she knew how. She ate. She ate massive amounts of chocolate and pastries until she was barely recognizable. And yet, Charles actually loved her. In his own dim, quiet way, he was devoted to her. When she died at 26, possibly of appendicitis or possibly poisoned, depending on which 17th century gossip you believe, Charles was genuinely heartbroken. He wandered the palace crying, which, given his appearance, must have been a truly tragic sight. But the monarchy had to go on. They married him off again, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg. Now, Maria Anna was a different breed. She wasn't a tragic eater. She was a political shark. She realized very quickly that Charles was never going to produce an heir. The guy was effectively sterile, which, considering the state of his DNA, was probably nature's way of saying enough is enough. Maria Anna spent her time faking pregnancies and screaming at the king's ministers. The court became a battleground of factions trying to decide who would take over Spain once Charles finally kicked the bucket. Charles, meanwhile, was getting weirder. He became obsessed with his ancestors. He actually had the royal tombs opened so he could look at the rotting corpses of his family. He spent hours staring at the mummified remains of his father and mother, perhaps looking for some clue as to why he felt so miserable. It's a very sleepless historian image, isn't it? A lonely, sickly king standing in a cold crypt, surrounded by the dust of a dying dynasty. By the end of his life, Charles was a mess. He was bald, he was partially deaf, and he suffered from constant seizures. He died in 1700, just shy of his 39th birthday. His autopsy, which, yes, they did, is one of the most famous and bizarre documents in medical history. The doctor claimed Charles did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, and his head was full of water. While that's likely a bit of theatrical exaggeration, it paints a picture of a man who was essentially a walking ghost long before he actually died. With Charles, the Spanish Habsburg line ended, not with a bang, but with a very quiet, very confused whimper. The result was the War of Spanish Succession, a massive European conflict that lasted 13 years, all because one man couldn't produce a child. All that death and destruction just because a family refused to stop marrying their cousins. It's a strange thing to think about, how the fate of millions of people rested on the fragile shoulders of a man who could barely stand up. Charles II wasn't a villain, he wasn't a hero, he was just a very sad, very sick man who was born into a role he was never meant to fill. He was a victim of his own bloodline, a cautionary tale about the dangers of royal ego and the limits of human biology. Let's just let that sink in for a moment. The silence of the Spanish court, the smell of incense and old stone, the sound of a king's heavy footsteps echoing in a hallway. We've covered the poets and the broken kings, but what about those who were just unnecessary? In the next part, we're going to look at the spare royals, the siblings, the younger sons, the cousins who have all the money in the world, a very fancy title, and absolutely nothing to do on a Tuesday afternoon. When you're second or third in line for a throne, you're basically a backup battery, vaguely necessary, but mostly just sitting in a drawer waiting for the primary one to fail. And when you have that much free time and a massive budget, things tend to get weird. Let's start with one of my favorites, Prince Gaston of Orleans. This was the younger brother of Louis XIII of France. Now, Louis XIII was already a bit of a mess. He was obsessed with hunting, had a stutter, and was constantly being bullied by Cardinal Richelieu. But Gaston? Gaston made being a younger brother into a professional career of chaos. He was charming, he was handsome, and he was pathologically incapable of staying out of trouble. Gaston spent his
Entire life was essentially one long, half-hearted attempt to overthrow his brother. He joined about a dozen different conspiracies. He'd sign a secret treaty, raise a small army, realize that he might actually have to fight a battle, and then immediately flee to the border, leaving all his friends to be executed by the king. And the funniest part? Louis XIII would always forgive him, because he was family. Gaston would come crawling back, say he was sorry, and Louis would give him a new palace and a pension. It was the 17th century version of a younger brother crashing your car and you giving him a better one because you don't want to explain it to your mom. Gaston spent his exile time building one of the most obsessive collections of oddities in Europe. He lived at the Château de Blois and filled it with botanical samples, rare books, and weird gadgets. He was the kind of guy who would spend 3 hours talking to you about the specific way a certain type of moss grows, while he was simultaneously planning to betray the French crown. He was elegantly useless, a man who lived a life of high stakes but never actually felt the consequences. He eventually died in a sort of quiet, comfortable obscurity, probably wondering why none of his coups ever worked. But if Gaston was a chaotic spare, let's look at someone a bit more decorative. Let's talk about the Duke of Cumberland, Prince Ernest Augustus. He was the son of George III, the Mad King, and he was easily the most hated man in England, which in the 1800s was a pretty high bar to clear. Ernest was the spare to the spare to the spare. He knew he was never going to be King of England, so he just leaned into being a villain. He had a massive scar across his face from a battle. He was a staunch ultra-conservative who hated basically everything modern, and he was the subject of some truly wild rumors. The most famous one involved his valet, a man named Celis. One night, Celis was found dead in his bed with his throat cut, and Ernest was found with head wounds. Ernest claimed Celis had tried to murder him and then committed suicide. The public, however, decided that Ernest had probably done it himself because he looked like the kind of guy who would do that. He lived his life in a cloud of scandal and cigar smoke. He was once described as having the most unpleasant face in the world. But here's the irony. When his niece, Queen Victoria, took the throne, Ernest finally got what he wanted. Because of Salic law, a woman couldn't inherit the throne of Hanover, so Ernest packed his bags and moved to Germany to become the King of Hanover. And surprisingly, he wasn't that bad at it. He was a grumpy, reactionary old man, but his subjects didn't hate him as much as the British did. He found his little corner of the world where he could be the main character, instead of the weird uncle everyone whispered about at weddings. It's a strange existence, being a royal spare. You're raised with the same education and the same expectations as a king, but you're never given the keys to the car. You end up like the Duke of Norfolk or the various archdukes of Austria, people who spent their lives perfecting their embroidery or collecting thousands of pairs of gloves or becoming world experts on rare butterflies.
There was Archduke Ludwig Salvator of Austria, who is a perfect example of the eccentric spare. He was part of the massive Habsburg machine in the late 1800s, but he hated the court in Vienna. He hated the uniforms, he hated the rules, and he especially hated the small talk. So what did he do? He bought a yacht and sailed to the island of Majorca. He spent the rest of his life there, living like a hermit scholar. He walked around in tattered clothes, looked like a common sailor, and wrote massive, multi-volume books about the geography and wildlife of the Mediterranean. People would see him on the road and offer him a few coins because they thought he was a beggar. He'd take the money, tip his hat, and go back to his palace. He was a royal who had opted out of being royal. He had all the money, none of the responsibility, and a very good tan. In the grand scheme of tragic history, Ludwig Salvator is one of the few who actually figured it out. He realized the throne was a trap, so he just walked away and talked to birds now. It makes you think about the pressure of the crown. The ones who wore it, like Charles II, were crushed by it. The ones who didn't, like Gaston or Ludwig, were left to drift in the breeze, becoming these strange, colorful footnotes in the margins of history books. They are the background noise of empires, vaguely ridiculous, slightly sad, but infinitely more interesting than the people who actually had to sign the laws. Let the image of Ludwig Salvator on his yacht fade into the mist. In the next part, we're going to head to the Far East. We're going to look at a royal life that started in a forbidden city and ended in a very humble garden. It's the story of the last emperor of China, and it's perhaps the most sleepless story of them all. Let's drift away from the damp palaces of Europe for a moment. Close your eyes and imagine a place so silent you can hear the rustle of silk from 3 rooms away. We're moving into the heart of Beijing, inside the Forbidden City. This is where we meet Puyi, the last emperor of China. If our previous friends were spares or biological disasters, Puyi was something else. He was a child who was turned into a god before he knew how to tie his own shoes, and then spent the rest of his life trying to figure out how to be a person. Puyi became emperor in 1908. He was 2 years old. Imagine being 2 and having thousands of grown men, scholars, generals, eunuchs, bowing till their foreheads hit the floor every time you walked into a room. He lived in a world of yellow silk. Yellow was the imperial color. No one else was allowed to wear it. He lived in a city of 9,999 rooms, yet he wasn't allowed to step outside the front gate. He was the most powerful person in the world on paper, but he couldn't even choose what he had for breakfast. His childhood was a fever dream of isolation. He didn't live with his mother. He was raised by eunuchs who catered to his every whim, but also whispered terrifying stories into his ears. Because he was a god, he couldn't be punished. If he did something wrong, one of the other children in the palace, his playmates, would be whipped. It's the kind of psychological setup that ensures you grow up to be a very strange adult. He spent his days playing with crickets in golden cages and watching the shadows move across the red walls. And then the world outside changed. In 1912, China became a republic. The empire was gone. But the new government decided to leave Puyi in his palace. They let him keep his title, his servants, and his yellow silk. So for years, he lived in a bubble. Inside the walls, it was the 14th century. Outside the walls, people were wearing suits, driving cars, and talking about democracy. He was a living ghost, a relic of a dead world residing in a very expensive museum. Eventually, even the museum closed. In 1924, he was kicked out of the Forbidden City. For the first time in his life, the son of heaven had to pack a suitcase. He ended up in Tianjin under the protection of the Japanese, where he started wearing Western suits and dark sunglasses. He looked like a 1920s jazz-age dandy, but he was still obsessed with getting his throne back. He was a man with a hole in his soul where a crown used to be. The Japanese saw this, and because they were imperialists with a sense of irony, they offered him a new throne. They made him the Emperor of Manchuria, a puppet state in Manchuria. He thought he was restoring the glory of his ancestors. In reality, he was a prisoner again. He sat in a cold palace in Changchun, signing papers he wasn't allowed to read, while the Japanese army did whatever they wanted. He was a prop, a golden ornament on a very violent machine. He spent those years in a state of constant paranoia. He was terrified of being poisoned. He became obsessed with his health, taking his temperature dozens of times a day and rubbing his skin with alcohol until it was raw. He was a man who had been told he was divine, but he felt like he was made of glass. When World War II ended and the Japanese Empire collapsed, Puyi was captured by the Soviets. He spent 5 years in a Siberian prison camp. Imagine the transition from yellow silk and hand-carved jade to a thin blanket and a bowl of watery soup in the Russian winter. But strangely, Puyi liked it. He later said he felt more normal in prison than he ever had in a palace. For the first time, he had to wash his own clothes. He had to make his own bed. He was learning how to be a human being at the age of 40. He was eventually sent back to communist China, where he underwent re-education. The former emperor of China became a gardener. He worked at the Beijing Botanical Gardens, tending to the flowers. There's a famous story of him visiting the Forbidden City as a tourist late in his life. He had to buy a ticket to enter his own childhood home. He walked through the halls where he had once been a god, and he pointed out to the tour guides that the throne was dusty. Puyi died in 1967, a quiet, humble citizen of the People's Republic of China. He died of kidney cancer, but in a way he had already been fading away for decades. He is the ultimate example of how history can chew a person up and spit them out. He started as a symbol and ended as a gardener.
Think about that for a second. The hands that once held the fate of millions, ending their days pruning roses in a public park. It's a very peaceful image, isn't it? A bit sad, but mostly just quiet. The long, loud history of the Qing dynasty ending with the snip of a pair of gardening shears. We've traveled from the poets of London to the tombs of Spain, through the bored hallways of Europe to the red walls of Beijing. History isn't always about the great battles or the grand speeches. Most of the time, it's about these people, these fragile, weird, lonely people, trying to figure out who they are when the world won't let them be anything at all. Let's let the garden grow quiet now. The sun is setting over the old city. The crickets are back in their grass, and the yellow silk is tucked away in a drawer. I think it's time to close the book for tonight. Sleep well, and remember, no matter how messy your life feels, at least you don't have a Habsburg jaw or a father who won't let you leave Wimpole Street. Part 5. The Prince, the Monk, and the Pink Fondant. So, we've seen the gardeners and the ghosts, but let's drift back to the snow-heavy streets of St. Petersburg in 1916. If you want a story about a royal life that felt like a fever dream, you have to talk about Prince Felix Yusupov. Felix was, in a word, extra. He was the wealthiest man in Russia, richer than the Tsar himself, according to some accounts. He grew up in palaces so opulent they make Versailles look like a studio apartment. But Felix didn't just want to be rich, he wanted to be interesting. As a teenager, he used to dress up in his mother's jewels and furs and go out to the theater just to see if he could pull it off. He lived a life of total, bored decadence. He had everything, so he valued nothing. But then he met Grigory Rasputin. Now, we've all heard of Rasputin, the mad monk with the magnetic eyes and the very questionable hygiene who had wormed his way into the heart of the Romanov family. To the Tsar and Tsarina, he was a holy man who could heal their hemophiliac son. To everyone else in Russia, he was a disaster waiting to happen.
And Felix, being a bored prince with a hero complex, decided that he was the one who had to save the monarchy by getting rid of the monk. The plan was, to put it mildly, a total mess. It was December, it was freezing, and Felix invited Rasputin over to his basement for tea and cakes. But these weren't just any cakes. They were laced with enough cyanide to kill a small village. Felix also had poisoned wine ready to go. He sat there, in this basement he had decorated specifically for a murder, playing guitar and singing songs to Rasputin, while the monk happily gobbled down the toxic treats. And this is where the story enters the realm of the absurd. Rasputin ate the cakes, he drank the wine, and he just sat there. He didn't die, he didn't even look nauseous, he just asked Felix to play another song on the guitar. Can you imagine the sheer, quiet panic Felix must have felt? He had just fed a man enough poison to stop a horse, and the man was asking for an encore. Eventually, Felix couldn't take the tension anymore. He pulled out a revolver and shot Rasputin. The monk fell. Felix and his co-conspirators cheered, thinking the job was finally done. But as Felix leaned over the body, Rasputin's eyes snapped open. He grabbed Felix by the throat, stood up, and crawled out of the basement into the snowy courtyard, screaming. It took several more shots and eventually throwing him into the frozen Malaya Nevka River to finally end the ordeal. Felix later wrote a memoir about this night, and it reads like a gothic novel written by someone who had had way too much absinthe. He portrayed himself as a tragic hero, but really, he was just a very wealthy young man who had stumbled into a nightmare of his own making. The irony? Killing Rasputin didn't save the monarchy. The Russian Revolution broke out just months later. Felix had to flee his palaces, leaving behind his millions and his jewels, and spent the rest of his life in Paris, living off the proceeds of his memoirs and suing film companies for how they portrayed him. He went from being the wealthiest man in Russia to a guy who spent his afternoons in cafes talking about the time he couldn't kill a monk. It's a strange, looping story of how the elite often think they can control the chaos of history, only to find out that history doesn't care about your titles or your poisoned cakes. Felix lived until 1967, the same year as Pouilly, dying in a modest apartment in Paris. Two men from opposite sides of the world, both born into unimaginable power, both ending their lives in quiet, ordinary rooms. Let's just let the snow fall over St. Petersburg now. The palaces are dark, the rivers are frozen, and the music has stopped. Everything is still. Everything is quiet. I think we've reached the end of our journey for tonight. We've wandered through the minds of poets, the tragedies of kings, and the strange, lingering shadows of empires. History is just a long, long sleep, punctuated by these odd, beautiful, and sometimes ridiculous moments. Rest easy. The world is old, the stories are told, and you are here, safe in the present. Good night. Let's leave the chaos of the Russian Revolution behind and head somewhere much colder and much quieter. We're moving up toward the Baltic, to the Swedish court of the 17th century. We're going to talk about Queen Christina. Now, if the Habsburgs were a biological disaster and Pouilly was a puppet, Christina was something else entirely. She was a woman who was born to be a king and spent her entire life trying to figure out how to be absolutely anything else. When Christina was born in 1626, her father, the legendary King Gustav Adolphus, was so convinced he was getting a son that when she arrived, the midwives initially told him he had a boy. She was born hairy and with a loud, hoarse voice, which, let's be honest, is a relatable way to enter the world. Her father didn't care. He decided to raise her exactly like a prince. She learned to hunt, she learned to ride, she stayed up all night studying philosophy, and she developed a legendary disdain for anything traditionally feminine. She hated jewelry, she hated fancy dresses, and she especially hated the idea of marriage. She became queen at the age of 6, after her father died back in battle. Imagine a 6-year-old being the Lion of the North. She was surrounded by stodgy, bearded Swedish advisors who wanted her to marry a cousin and produce an heir to keep the dynasty going. But Christina had other plans. She wanted to turn Stockholm into the Athens of the North. She invited the most brilliant minds in Europe to her cold, dark palace, including the philosopher René Descartes. Poor Descartes. He was used to the warmth of France, and Christina insisted on having her philosophy lessons at 5 in the morning in a drafty, unheated library during a Swedish winter. He actually died of pneumonia just a few months after arriving. Christina had literally thought a man to death. It's a very dry, intellectual kind of tragedy. As the years went on, the pressure to marry became unbearable. Her advisors were practically begging her to pick a husband. So, Christina did the most dramatic thing a royal could do. She didn't just refuse to marry, she abdicated. She gave up the throne, packed her bags, dressed in men's clothes, and rode south. She converted to Catholicism, which was a huge scandal for a Swedish queen, and headed straight for Rome. Imagine the Pope's face when the most famous Protestant queen in the world shows up at the Vatican gates wearing boots and a sword, asking for a place to stay. She became the ultimate royal influencer of 17th century Rome. She lived in the Palazzo Corsini, filled it with incredible art, and spent her time meddling in papal politics and running her own private academy. She never married, she never had children, and she never went back to Sweden. She was a woman who traded a crown for a life of her own choosing. She was eccentric, she was loud, and she smelled like horses, but she was free. When she died in 1689, she was one of the few women ever buried in the grottos of St. Peter's Basilica. She started as a Swedish king-in-waiting and ended as a Roman legend. Let the cold winds of Stockholm fade away now. Replace them with the warm, dusty sunlight of a Roman courtyard. The books are closed, the sword is put away, the queen is finally at rest. So, we've escaped to Rome with Christina, but let's float back to France. Not the France of Napoleon or the barricades, but the France of the late 1700s, the sunset of the old world. We have to talk about Louis XVI. Now, poor Louis is usually remembered for two things: losing his head and having a wife who may or may not have said something about cake. But if you look at the man himself, away from the guillotine, he was perhaps the most relatable, socially awkward person to ever sit on a throne. Louis XVI was never supposed to be the Sun King. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't particularly charismatic, and he suffered from a severe case of wanting to be literally anywhere else. His idea of a perfect day wasn't presiding over a grand ball at Versailles. It was being alone in his attic workshop, covered in grease, fixing clocks. He was obsessed with locks. He loved the way the tumblers clicked into place. He loved the predictability of gears. Unlike the people of France, locks were logical. If you turned the key correctly, the lock did what it was supposed to do. Politics, on the other hand, made no sense to him. He was a big, shy, slightly clumsy man who walks with a bit of a waddle. He was nearsighted but hated wearing glasses because he thought they looked undignified. So he spent most of his life squinting at people, which made everyone think he was either angry or incredibly deep. In reality, he was just trying to see who was talking to him. And then there was his marriage to Marie Antoinette. It took them 7 years to consummate the marriage. 7 years. In the world of royal dynasties, where the primary job of a king is to produce an heir, this was an absolute disaster. The entire world was gossiping about it. Louis wasn't disinterested, he was just terrified. He was a man who found comfort in the mechanical, and the mechanics of human intimacy were far more intimidating than a complex Swiss timepiece. Eventually, his brother-in-law, the Emperor of Austria, had to sit him down for a very awkward birds and the bees talk.
It worked, but by then, the public had already decided that the king was weak and the queen was a mess. Louis tried to be a good king. He really did. He wanted to be loved. He would go out for walks in the woods and try to chat with the local peasants, but he was so painfully shy that the conversations usually consisted of him saying something about the weather and then staring at his shoes until the peasant walked away. He was a man out of time. He was a 20th century hobbyist trapped in an 18th century absolute monarchy. Then came the diamond necklace affair. It's one of the most absurd true crime stories in history. A con artist named Jean de Valois Saint-Remy convinced a cardinal that the queen wanted to buy an insanely expensive diamond necklace in secret. The cardinal, who was desperate for the queen's favor, bought it and gave it to Jean, who promptly took it apart and sold the diamonds in London. When the bill came due, the whole thing blew up. Marie Antoinette was completely innocent. She actually hated the necklace, but the public didn't care. They used it as proof that the royals were decadent and corrupt, while the people were starving. Louis watched his world crumble with a kind of numb, quiet resignation. Even when the revolution started, he couldn't quite grasp the stakes. On July 14, 1789, the day the Bastille was stormed, he wrote a single word in his diary: rien, nothing. He meant he hadn't killed any deer while hunting that day. The world was ending, and Louis was disappointed because he didn't get a trophy for his wall. In the end, even his execution was a strangely quiet affair. He stepped up to the guillotine with more dignity than he had ever shown in life. He forgave his enemies. He hoped his blood would cement the happiness of the French people. He was a man who was too kind for his job and too slow for his era. Let the sound of the clinking clock gears fill your mind. Imagine Louis in his attic, the sun setting over the gardens of Versailles, the smell of oil and metal. He's happy there. The world is outside, but the lock in his hand is perfect. Let's float away from the sharp edges of the French Revolution and head into the misty, pine-scented mountains of 19th century Bavaria. If Louis XVI was a man who wanted to be a locksmith, Ludwig II of Bavaria was a man who wanted to be a dream. He's often called the Mad King, but I prefer to think of him as a man who was profoundly allergic to reality. Ludwig became king in 1864 when he was only 18. He was strikingly handsome, tall with dark brooding eyes and a shock of curly hair. He looked like the hero of a romantic poem, and for a while, the people of Bavaria absolutely adored him. But Ludwig had a secret. He hated being a king. He hated the meetings, he hated the ministers, and he especially hated the boring, dusty business of ruling a state that was slowly being swallowed up by the growing power of Prussia. So Ludwig decided to build his own world. If the real world was loud and ugly and full of politicians, his world would be made of stone and swan-shaped boats and Wagnerian operas. He became obsessed with the composer Wagner. He spent a fortune, and I mean a literal fortune, paying off Wagner's debts and building him theaters. To Ludwig, Wagner's music wasn't just art. It was the soundtrack to a world he felt he actually belonged in. He started building castles that looked like they belonged on a cover of a storybook. The most famous one, Neuschwanstein, is the one Disney used as a model for Sleeping Beauty's castle. But imagine living there. It wasn't a home, it was a stage set. Ludwig became a creature of the night. He would sleep all day and stay up all night, wandering through his empty palaces by candlelight. He had a dining table built on a hydraulic lift, the wishing table, so that it could be set in the kitchen and raised up through the floor. This way, he could eat his dinner in total isolation without having to look at or speak to a single human servant. He would take midnight sled rides through the Bavarian Alps, dressed in 18th century costumes, his servants shivering in the snow, while he sat in a gilded carriage shaped like a swan. He was a man who was desperately trying to outrun the 19th century. He built a grotto at Linderhof Palace, an artificial cave with an underground lake, where he would sit in a boat shaped like a swan and listen to singers perform scenes from Wagner's operas. The water was heated, and the cave was lit by the first electric lights in Bavaria. It was a technical marvel used for the most useless, beautiful purpose imaginable. But you can't spend all the country's money on swan boats and artificial caves without people getting a little bit annoyed. His ministers were terrified. Bavaria was going broke, and the king was currently planning a fourth castle that was even more expensive than the last. They decided that the only way to stop him was to declare him insane. In 1886, a group of doctors who had never actually examined him pronounced him mad and unfit to rule. They went to Neuschwanstein to arrest him. Ludwig, in his typical dramatic fashion, tried to hide in the towers, but eventually he was taken away to Berg Castle. A few days later, Ludwig went for a walk by the shores of Lake Starnberg with his doctor. They never came back. Their bodies were found in the shallow water later that night. To this day, nobody knows exactly what happened. Was it a suicide? Was it an escape attempt gone wrong? Or did the government decide that a dead king was easier to manage than a mad one? Whatever the truth, the Swan King was gone. He left behind a legacy of beautiful, empty castles and a mystery that still hangs over the Bavarian mist. He was a man who spent his whole life trying to turn his dreams into stone, only to find that stone is very heavy and dreams are very fragile. Let the sound of the Wagnerian horns fade into the wind. The mountains are dark, the lakes are still, and the castles are empty. Let's stay in the mountains for a moment, but move across the border from Bavaria into the glittering, suffocating heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We need to talk about Elizabeth of Austria, affectionately known as Sissy. If Ludwig of Bavaria was a man who wanted to be a dream, Elizabeth was a woman who wanted to be a bird. She was a woman who possessed everything the world told her she should want: beauty, a crown, and the love of an emperor, and she spent her entire life trying to run away from it all. Sissy was born into a relatively relaxed branch of the Bavarian royal family. She spent her childhood climbing trees and riding horses, but when she was 16, she caught the eye of the young emperor Franz Joseph. He was supposed to marry her older sister, but he took one look at Sissy and decided he had to have her. It sounds like a fairy tale, but for Sissy, it was the beginning of a long, gilded imprisonment. The Viennese court was the most rigid, traditional, and boring place in Europe. Every minute of her day was planned by her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, who treated Sissy like a slow-witted child. Sissy was expected to sit still for hours, to attend endless banquets, and to be a silent ornament. But Sissy wasn't an ornament. She was restless, she was intelligent, and she was deeply, profoundly melancholic. She dealt with the pressure by becoming obsessed with her own beauty. She was famous for her hair, which reached all the way to her feet. It took 3 hours every single day to brush and style it. 3 hours. While her hair was being done, she would learn languages: Greek, Hungarian, English. She used the time to build a wall between her and the court. She also practiced extreme diets and exercise. She had gymnastics rings installed in her dressing room and would spend hours working out, terrified of gaining a single pound. She was in many ways the first modern celebrity, tortured by her own image. As the years led to more tragedy, the loss of her children, most notably her son Rudolph in a double suicide at Merling, Sissy checked out of royal life completely. She bought a ship. She spent her time sailing the Mediterranean, often in the middle of terrifying storms. She had an anchor tattooed on her shoulder, which was a scandalous thing for an empress to do, but she didn't care. She felt at home only when she was moving, when the wind was in her face and the land was a distant blur. She wore a black veil for the last decade of her life, refusing to let the world see her age. She wanted to remain a ghost, a legend of beauty that never faded. She died in 1898, assassinated by an anarchist in Geneva who didn't even know who she was. He just wanted to kill a royal, any royal. She was stabbed with a sharpened file, and she didn't even realize she had been hurt at first. She boarded her boat, collapsed, and that was it. The bird had finally flown away. It's a quiet, tragic end to a life spent in a cage of silk and diamonds. Think of Sissy now, not as the empress on the stamps, but as a woman on the deck of a ship, looking out at the dark water, finally free of the weight of her own hair. Part 10. The Clockmaker of the Vatican and the Last Light. We've sailed the Mediterranean with Sisi, and now, as the night truly settles in, let's drift toward our final destination. We're going to end our journey in the quietest place of all, the shadow of the Dome of St. Peter's in Rome. We've talked about emperors who lost their empires and queens who fled their crowns, but let's talk about a man who was handed the keys to the kingdom and spent his nights wishing he was back in a dusty village library. Let's talk about Pope Leo XIII. Now, before you think this is going to be a lecture on theology, don't worry, we're here for the vibe. Leo was born Giacomo Pecci in 1810, and he lived to be 93 years old. He was so thin and so pale that people called him the Alabaster Pope. He looked like he was carved out of a single piece of white marble, and he moved with a slow, deliberate grace that made it seem like he was floating rather than walking. Leo was a man of intense, quiet habits. He was one of the first popes to be filmed by a motion picture camera, and there's a wonderful, grainy clip of him sitting in a garden, waving his hand in a slow-motion blessing. He looks like a creature from another dimension, a relic of the ancient world, blinking in the light of the 20th century. But his personal life was surprisingly simple. He was a man who loved his Vin Mariani, which was a popular wine at the time infused with coca leaves. Yes, the Pope had his own personal stash of medicinal coca wine, and he even appeared on a poster for it, saying it supported his frail constitution. It's a very 19th century way to keep a 90-year-old man running a global institution. But what I love most about Leo was his obsession with Latin poetry. While the world outside was inventing the light bulb, the telephone, and the automobile, Leo was sitting in his private study late at night, writing long, intricate poems in Latin about the invention of the photograph. He wrote a poem to the Ars Photographica, praising the way light could capture a face forever. He was a man trying to bridge the gap between the Middle Ages and the modern world, with nothing but a fountain pen and a dead language. He spent his final years in the Vatican gardens, which he treated as his own private kingdom. He would sit for hours watching the birds or talking to the gardeners about the specific way to prune a lemon tree. He was the prisoner of the Vatican, as popes called themselves then, but he didn't seem to mind the walls. He had his books, his wine, and his Latin verses. When he finally died in 1803, it was the end of an era. He had lived through the rise and fall of Napoleon, the unification of Italy, and the birth of the modern world. He was a bridge between centuries, a quiet, ivory-colored figure who watched the world change from behind a stone wall. And so we come to the end of our long walk through the corridors of the past. From the dark rooms of Wimpole Street to the swan boats of Bavaria, from the yellow silk of Beijing to the white robes of the Vatican. History isn't just a list of dates. It's a collection of people, lonely people, tired people, people who were just trying to find a quiet corner in a very loud world. The lights are out now. The ghosts of Habsburgs have returned to their crypts. The Browning's letters are tucked away in their envelopes. The last emperor has finished his gardening, and the snow has stopped falling on the Russian palaces. If you're still with me, if your eyes are still heavy but not quite closed, let's drift one last time. We're going to a place of absolute shimmering isolation. We're going to the court of Korea in the late 19th century to meet King Gojong. While the rest of the world was industrializing and building steamships, Gojong was living in a palace that felt like a dream within a dream. Gojong was a man who lived in a state of permanent, quiet anxiety. He was surrounded by powerful neighbors, China, Japan, Russia, all of them looking at his kingdom like a piece of fruit ready to be plucked. And inside his own palace, he was surrounded by his wife's powerful family. His wife, Empress Myeong-song, was the real power behind the throne. She was brilliant, sharp, and terrifyingly ambitious. Gojong, by contrast, just wanted everything to stay exactly as it was. He was a man who loved the night. He would stay up until dawn, often working by the light of the very first electric lamps in East Asia. He had a fascination with Western technology, but he used it in the most insular way possible. He had a private coffee room built, the Duxu Palace, where he could sit in a velvet armchair and drink coffee, a luxury that felt like a magic potion to him. He would sit there for hours, the bitter smell of the beans mixing with the scent of ancient incense, watching the shadows of the pine trees dance on the paper walls. There's a tragic, slow-motion beauty to Gojong's life. After his wife was assassinated by Japanese agents in a brutal midnight raid, Gojong became even more of a hermit. He was terrified of being poisoned, so he refused to eat anything that wasn't brought to him in a locked metal box. He eventually fled his own palace and lived in the Russian legation for a year, ruling his country from a spare bedroom while drinking tea and staring out the window at the streets he could no longer walk. He declared himself an emperor in 1897, a grand title for a man whose power was slipping through his fingers like sand. He designed new uniforms for his soldiers that looked like something out of a European parade, while the reality of his situation was becoming increasingly grim. He was a man playing dress-up in a world that had no more room for kings. In the end, he was forced to abdicate by the Japanese. He spent his final years as a king emeritus, a title that meant absolutely nothing. He lived in the Duxu Palace, the place with the coffee and the electric lights, and he watched as his country was slowly erased from the map. He died in 1919, and rumors swirled that he had finally been poisoned, not by a rival, but by the very forces of history he had tried so hard to ignore. Imagine him now, sitting in that quiet, darkened room. The coffee is cold, the electric light is flickering. Outside, the world is moving into a new, loud century, but inside, Gojong is just a man in a velvet chair, listening to the silence of a kingdom that no longer exists. The story of Gojong is the story of the last flicker of a candle before the wind blows it out. It's the final, quiet note of a very long song. And now, truly, the song is over. The palaces are all empty, the coffee is gone, the lanterns have burned down to nothing. There are no more kings to follow, no more poets to hear, and no more ghosts to chase. The history of the world is tucked into bed, and it's time for you to be too. The air in your room is cool, the blankets are heavy, your mind is a blank white page ready for the dreams of tomorrow. Sleep now. Everything is finished. If you are still awake, then you must be drifting in that strange liminal space, the one where the edges of the room start to blur and the weight of your own body feels like it's sinking into the mattress. So let's go to a place that matches that feeling. We're traveling to the 16th century to the Hrdskany Castle in Prague. We're going to spend our final moments with Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Emperor, who decided that the world was too chaotic to rule, so he decided to simply collect it instead. Rudolph was a Habsburg, but he lacked the chin and the fire of his ancestors. He was a man of deep, heavy silences and long bouts of melancholy, what we might call depression today. He moved the entire imperial court from Vienna to Prague because he liked the atmosphere there. He liked the way the mist settled over the Charles Bridge and the way the alchemists' fires flickered in the dark alleys. He didn't care about the religious wars tearing Europe apart. He didn't care about the Ottoman Empire or the tax revolts. Rudolph cared about things. He turned his castle into a Kunstkammer, a cabinet of curiosities that spanned miles of hallways. He had rooms filled with nothing but clocks, rooms filled with nothing but preserved animals, rooms filled with unicorn horns, which were actually narwhal tusks, and automated mechanical dolls that could play the flute. He sat in the middle of this vast, dusty museum like a spider in a web of wonders. He spent his days with astronomers like Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler, trying to map the stars, not because he wanted to navigate the seas, but because he wanted to find the hidden geometry of the universe. He spent his nights with alchemists who promised they could turn lead into gold. He didn't actually need the gold. He was an emperor. He just liked the idea that the world was more mysterious than it looked. One of his favorite possessions was a portrait of himself, painted by Giuseppe Arcimboldo. But it wasn't a normal portrait. It was a face made entirely of vegetables. His nose was a pear, his cheeks were peaches, and his beard was made of wheat. It's a ridiculous image, but Rudolph loved it. He saw himself as a man made of the earth, a person who was just a collection of various beautiful pieces. As he got older, his paranoia grew. He became a ghost in his own palace. He had secret passages built so he could move from room to room without being seen by his courtiers. He would spend hours staring at a single painting by Bruegel or Dürer, losing himself in the brushstrokes until he forgot he had an empire to run. He eventually lost his power to his brother, Matthias, who staged a slow-motion coup. Rudolph didn't even fight back. He just asked to keep his collections. When he died in 1612, he was a man who had successfully lived his entire life inside his own head. He had turned the Holy Roman Empire into a backdrop for his private museum. He was the ultimate sleepless historian, a man who spent his life looking backward and inward, ignoring the noise of the future. Now, imagine those long hallways in Prague. The thousands of clocks are all ticking, but they're at different times. The mechanical dolls have long since wound down. The mist is pressing against the windows of the castle. Rudolph is gone, but the feeling of his world remains. A world where everything is a curiosity and everything is still. The museum is closing now. The curator is walking through the galleries, blowing out the candles one by one. The unicorn horns are fading into the shadows. The vegetable king is retreating into the dark. Your journey is done. The 12 parts are complete. The hours have drifted by like the leaves in a palace garden. There are no more stories left to tell. The ink has dried. The voice is a whisper. The whisper is a breath. If you are still here, floating in this half-lit world of history, then perhaps you're waiting for the very last vibration of the string. So let's travel to one of the most obscure and quietest corners of the 18th century. We are going to the tiny, fog-drenched principality of Anhalt-Zerbst in Germany. It's a place so small that if you blinked while riding a horse through it, you'd miss it entirely. And there, we find a young girl named Sophie, sitting in a cold room, playing a clavichord that barely makes a sound. Sophie was a poor princess, which is a hilarious concept, but in the world of royals, it just meant her palace didn't have enough firewood and her dresses were last year's fashion. She was a spare part in the great engine of European marriage. But Sophie had a secret. She wasn't just a quiet girl in a small town. She was a sponge. She sat in her window seat for years, reading every book she could get her hands on, teaching herself how to be anyone other than who she was. She was eventually plucked from her obscurity and sent to Russia to marry the heir to the throne, Peter III. Now, Peter was a challenge. He was a man-child who preferred playing with toy soldiers in his bed to talking to his wife. He once held a full military funeral for a rat that chewed the head off one of his led generals. Imagine being a brilliant, ambitious teenager married to a man who spends his afternoons court-martialing rodents. Sophie, who took the name Catherine, didn't complain. She didn't have a breakdown. She just waited. She spent her nights in the cold Russian palaces, teaching herself Russian by candlelight, walking barefoot in her room to stay awake so she could memorize her vocabulary. She was a ghost in the court of the Empress Elizabeth, a girl who made herself invisible so that she could eventually become everything. She lived in a world of whispers. For years, she had no power, no friends, and a husband who actively disliked her. She spent her time in a state of hyper-observation. She watched how people bowed. She noticed who took bribes. She learned the exact rhythm of the Russian Orthodox soul. She was building an empire in her mind long before she ever touched a scepter. The irony of Catherine the Great, because that's who our little Sophie became, was that she started as the ultimate sleepless observer. She was a woman who was forgotten by history until she decided to write history herself. She eventually overthrew her toy soldier husband in a coup that was remarkably quiet,
mostly because everyone was just relieved to have someone in charge who wasn't holding funerals for rats. But even when she was the most powerful woman on Earth, she still had that habit from her childhood. She was a chronic insomniac. She would wake up at 5 in the morning, light her own fire, and spend the hours before the world woke up writing letters to the philosophers of Europe. She was still that girl in Anhalt Zerbst, sitting in the dark, trying to understand how the world worked. Think of her now, not as the empress of all the Russias, but as a young girl at a silent clavichord. The keys move, but the sound is just a ghost of a note. The room is cold, but she is warm with the fire of her own thoughts. The fire is burning down now. The candle is a pool of wax. The books are closed. The empire is asleep. The story of Sophie is the story of the quietest girl in the room becoming the loudest voice in the century. But tonight, there are no voices. There is only the soft, rhythmic breathing of the world. The 12 parts are gone. The 13th is a fading echo. There is no part 14. There is only the end. If the silence hasn't claimed you yet, if you are still drifting in that hazy, purple twilight of the mind, then we must go to the water. We've been to palaces and gardens, but let's end our journey on the deck of a ship that never quite arrived. We're traveling to the late 18th century to follow a man named Jean-François de Galapou, the Comte de la Pérouse. He was the French answer to Captain Cook, a man commissioned by Louis XVI, the locksmith king we met earlier, to map the parts of the world that were still just blank spaces on the parchment. La Pérouse was the ultimate professional. He wasn't a conqueror or a pirate. He was a scientist with a telescope and a very quiet soul. In 1785, he set sail with 2 ships, the Bassoul and the Astrolabe, filled with botanists, astronomers, and enough fine china to host a gala in the middle of the Pacific. Louis XVI was so obsessed with this mission that even as he was being led to the guillotine years later, his last words were reportedly, "Is there any news of La Pérouse?" There wasn't, because La Pérouse had simply disappeared. Imagine the life on those ships. Months of nothing but the rhythmic creaking of timber and the endless blue-gray horizon of the sea. La Pérouse spent his nights on the quarterdeck staring at stars that had no European names yet. He was a man who lived in the nowhere between continents. He visited Easter Island, he mapped the coast of California, and he sailed through the mists of Alaska. He was a collector of coastlines, a man who found peace in the vast, empty middle of the ocean. In 1788, he stopped at Botany Bay in Australia, waved a polite hello to the British who had just arrived, sent his journals back to France on a passing ship, and then sailed away into a storm. For 40 years, the world stayed silent. He became a ghost story for sailors. He was the man who had sailed off the edge of the map. Eventually, the wreckage was found on a tiny reef-ringed island called Vanikoro. It turns out his ships had struck the coral in a cyclone. Some say he lived out his days on the island, a French count in a grass hut, watching the waves and waiting for a sail that never came. I like to think he didn't mind the wait. He was a man who spent his life looking at the horizon. Perhaps, in the end, he was happy to finally become part of it.
Think of the Boussole now. It's not a shipwreck, it's a cradle, rocking gently in the deep, dark currents of the Pacific. The charts are floating away, the ink dissolving into the salt water. The blank spaces on the map are finally filled with blue. We are like those ships now, La Pérouse and us. We've sailed past the poets, the kings, the monks, and the empresses. We've crossed the oceans of time, and we finally reached the place where the maps end. There are no more parts, no more pages, and no more names. There is only the deep, rhythmic pulse of the sea. If you are still here, then you have traveled farther than almost anyone. You are the last guest at the party, the final candle flickering in a ballroom that has long since gone cold. So let's go to a place that matches this feeling of lingering, a place of snow and silence, and the soft white noise of a dying dream. We are going to the winter of 1620 to the Kingdom of Bohemia to meet Frederick V. Frederick is known to history as the Winter King. He was a man who was given a crown in the autumn, wore it through the frost, and lost it before the spring thaw. He was the ultimate temporary ruler, a man whose entire legacy is defined by how briefly he existed in the spotlight. He was young, he was handsome, and he was completely out of his depth. He accepted a throne he couldn't keep in a city, Prague, that was already preparing for a war that would last 30 years. But imagine his life during those few months of royalty. The castle was drafty, the stone floors were freezing, and the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and old tapestry. Frederick didn't spend his time planning battles or shoring up his defenses. No, he spent his time with his wife, Elizabeth Stuart, the daughter of the King of England, trying to create a garden of earthly delights in the middle of a war zone. They were a couple who lived in a bubble of art and romance while the world outside was sharpening its swords. They brought over Italian musicians and French gardeners. They wanted to turn the rugged hills of Bohemia into a landscape of fountains and statues. They lived in a state of beautiful, tragic denial. They spent their evenings listening to the lute, the music drifting up into the high vaulted ceilings of the palace, while the snow piled up against the gates. When the Battle of White Mountain finally came, it was over in less than an hour. Frederick was at lunch when his army collapsed. He had to pack his bags in such a hurry that he reportedly left his crown behind in a carriage. He spent the rest of his life wandering through Europe, a king without a kingdom, living in a series of rented houses, always hoping that someone would give him his throne back. But there is a peace in being a winter king. He didn't have to grow old and bitter on a throne. He remained, in the memory of history, a young man in a velvet cloak, forever standing in a snowy garden. He is the personification of the temporary. He reminds us that everything, empires, crowns, and even our own worries, is just a season. The winter comes, the snow covers everything, and then it melts away, leaving nothing but the grass. Think of Frederick now. He isn't running from a battle. He's just standing on a balcony in Prague, looking out at the city. The flakes are falling, large and slow, settling on his shoulders. The world is perfectly white. The sound of the lute is fading. The lute player has gone home. The fire in the hearth is just a glow of orange embers. This is the end of our journey. We have reached the 15th part, the final station. We have covered the poets, the madmen, the collectors, and the ghosts. We have walked through the long, winding hallway of human memory, and we have reached the door at the end. Beyond this door, there is no more history. There are no more dates, no more names, and no more snarky asides. There is only the soft, dark velvet of sleep. The Winter King is bowing to you. He is stepping back into the snow. The door is closing, very slowly, very quietly. If you are still here, then you are a true traveler of the night. You've outlasted the Winter King, the gardener emperor, and the ladies with the 3-hour hair. You are drifting now in a place where time doesn't really have a shape anymore. So let's talk about a man who tried to give it one. Let's talk about Charles V. Now, Charles was the grandfather of our friend with the big jaw in part 2, but he was a different kind of disaster. He was the most powerful man in the world, the ruler of an empire where the sun never set, and he spent the last years of his life in a tiny room surrounded by 100 ticking clocks, trying to make them all strike at the exact same second. Charles V had everything: Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, most of the Americas. He spent 40 years riding across Europe, fighting wars, arguing with popes, and generally being the busiest person on the planet. But one day, he just stopped. He realized he was tired. His gout hurt, his head felt heavy, and he was sick of the sound of people asking him for things. So he did something almost no emperor ever does. He quit.
He retired to a small remote monastery in Ustay, Spain. It wasn't a palace, it was a simple stone building tucked into a forest. He brought with him his books, his favorite paintings, and a massive collection of clocks. Why clocks? Because Charles had spent 40 years trying to control people, and he failed. He thought that maybe, just maybe, he could control time instead. He would sit in his chair, the Spanish sun slanting through the window, and listen to the symphony of gears. Tick, tick, tick. He would spend hours with a tiny screwdriver, adjusting the balance wheels, trying to synchronize them. But no matter how hard he worked, they always drifted. One would strike noon, and then another would strike a few seconds later. He eventually sighed and said, "How can I expect to make men live in harmony when I cannot even make these clocks strike together?" It's a very quiet, very dry kind of realization. He spent his final days conducting rehearsals for his own funeral. He would lie in a coffin, wrapped in a shroud, while the monks sang dirges around him. He wanted to see what the world would look like without him. He wanted to practice being a ghost. He lived in the afterward while he was still breathing. Think of Charles now. He isn't the ruler of the world. He's just a tired man in a black robe sitting in a room full of clocks. The sun is setting over the Spanish hills. The birds in the forest are settling into the trees. One by one, the clocks are running down. The ticking is getting slower. Tick, tick, tick. The gears are coming to a rest. The tension in the springs is fading. The monastery is falling into a deep, stone-cold silence. This is the end of all history. It doesn't end with a battle or a speech. It ends with a single clock stopping in a quiet room. It ends with the realization that the world will keep turning, whether we are watching it or not. The 16 parts are finished. The monologue has reached its final shore. The voice is merging with the shadows. There is nothing left to say, nothing left to remember, and nothing left to do. If you are still here, then you are no longer a listener. You have become a part of the landscape. You are the shadow on the wall, the dust mote dancing in the moonlight, the very breath of the history we've been tracing. So for our 17th and final movement, let's go to a place that doesn't exist on any map. We're going to the mind of an old man in the 19th century, a man named Joseph Marie Jacquard. Now, Jacquard wasn't a king or a prince. He was a weaver, but he did something that would eventually allow us to be here tonight, talking across the air. He invented a loom that used punched cards to create incredibly complex patterns in silk. It was the world's first program. He took the chaos of thread and turned it into the logic of a machine. But imagine Jacquard at the end of his life. He lived in a small house in the French countryside, far from the noisy factories of Lyon. He spent his days sitting in his garden, watching the spiders weave their webs between the rose bushes. He realized that no matter how complex his loom was, it could never match the quiet, silver perfection of a spider's silk. He lived in a world of patterns. He saw the way the seasons shifted from the green of spring to the gold of autumn as a kind of giant, slow-moving tapestry. He saw the stars as a series of punched cards, a code written by a hand he couldn't see. He wasn't interested in fame or money anymore. He just wanted to sit in the stillness and watch the threads of the world settle into place. He would sit there until the sun went down, his hands, once so busy with needles and silk, resting quietly on his knees. He became a master of the long view. He understood that every life we've talked about tonight, the Brownings, the Habsburgs, the emperors, and the clockmakers, was just a single thread in a cloth that goes on forever. Some threads are gold, some are black, some are frayed, and some are bright crimson. But they all belong to the same weave.
Think of that tapestry now. It's vast, it's soft, and it's draped over the entire world. It covers the palaces of Prague and the gardens of Beijing. It wraps around the ships in the Pacific and the monastery in Spain. And it's wrapping around you, too. It's a heavy, warm fabric made of time and memory, and it's pulling you down into the deep, dark comfort of the loom. The weaving has stopped for the night. The shuttles are still. The threads are tied off. The pattern is complete for today. Tomorrow, the loom will start again, but that is a long way off. For now, there is only the finished work, the soft texture of the past, and the absolute quiet of the artisan's house. The 17 parts are a circle. We have come back to the beginning, to the quiet room where we started. The voice is dissolving into the fabric. The words are becoming part of the weave. Part 18, the moonlit observatory of the silent monk. If you are still with me, then you have moved beyond the tapestry. You are drifting now in the space between the threads, in that quiet, empty air where the world forgets itself. So let's go to the highest point we can find. We're traveling to the year 1848, to the Vatican Observatory, to meet Father Angelo Secchi. Now, Father Secchi was a Jesuit priest, but he didn't spend his nights kneeling in a cathedral. He spent them on the roof, peering through a long brass telescope at the stars. While Italy was erupting in revolution and the Pope was fleeing for his life, Father Secchi was looking at the sun. He was the first person to realize that stars aren't just points of light. They are made of the same stuff we are. He was the first to classify them by their colors, the deep reds, the brilliant blues, the pale yellows. Imagine him up there, high above the frantic streets of Rome. The city is full of shouting and torches and the sounds of distant drums, but up on the roof it is perfectly still. The air is cool and smells of ancient stone and ozone. Secchi is a man who has found a way to look past the chaos of human history and into the deep, frozen silence of the cosmos. He used to sit in the dark for hours, letting his eyes adjust until he could see the faint, ghostly glow of nebulae. He wasn't looking for God, and he wasn't looking for fame. He was just looking for the truth of the light. He once said that the stars were like the scattered thoughts of a sleeping mind. He saw the universe as a giant, glowing dream that we all happen to be sharing. As he got older, he became increasingly quiet. He realized that the more he knew about the stars, the less he needed to say about anything else. He lived in a world of spectral lines and planetary shadows. When people would come to him with their political worries or their personal dramas, he would simply point upward. He didn't have to say a word. The scale of the sky said it all for him. Think of Father Secchi now. He's packing away his lenses for the night. The brass of the telescope is cold under his fingers. He's blowing out the small oil lamp on his desk. The roof of the observatory is bathed in nothing but moonlight. Rome is a dark smudge below him, but the stars above are a million brilliant, unblinking eyes. He's walking down the spiral stone stairs, his sandals clicking softly against the steps. The sound echoes up into the dome, a slow, rhythmic tap, tap, tap that sounds like a heart beating in a large, hollow chest. He's going to his small wooden bed where he will sleep without dreams because he has already seen everything he needs to see. We are at the end of the observatory. We are at the end of the stars. The light has traveled billions of years just to reach your eyes, and now it is finally fading. The blue stars are dimming. The red stars are glowing low like embers. The yellow stars are winking out. The 18 parts have formed a bridge to the very edge of the universe. There are no more stairs to climb. There are no more telescopes to peek through. There is only the vast, dark, beautiful nothingness that holds everything together. If you are still here, then you are truly a creature of the deep night, drifting in the quiet spaces where even the stars begin to blur. We have climbed the observatory and we have seen the stars, but for our 19th movement, let's descend.
Let's go back to the Earth, but to a very specific, hidden part of it. We are traveling to the edge of the 19th century, to a small, private estate in the suburbs of Kyoto, to meet a man who spent 40 years doing absolutely nothing but tending to a single sunken garden. This man was once a high-ranking official, a man who dealt in the sharp, loud world of taxes and laws. But when he retired, he decided that the world was far too noisy for a soul that wanted to listen. He built a garden that sat lower than the rest of the ground, surrounded by high stone walls, so that when you stepped into it, the sounds of the city simply vanished. It was a garden of moss, silver sand, and a single ancient plum tree that leaned over a pond like a tired traveler. Imagine him in the late autumn. The air is crisp, and the smell of damp earth and cedar is heavy in the garden. He doesn't plant bright, shouting flowers. He prefers the moss, the deep velvet greens that grow in the shadows. He spends his mornings with a small bamboo rake, creating ripples in the silver sand that mimic the movement of water. It is a task that is never finished, a pattern that is erased by the wind and the rain every night, only to be drawn again the next day. He is a man who has learned the language of stones. He knows that a stone doesn't just sit there, it holds a position. It has a weight and a history that stretches back long before there were emperors or poets. He sits on his wooden veranda for hours, watching the way the light changes on the surface of the pond. He isn't waiting for anything. He is just being present for the arrival of the shadows. In the evenings, he lights a single stone lantern. It doesn't cast much light, just enough to show the curve of a branch or the ripple of a koi fish in the dark water. He sits in that dim golden glow, sipping a cup of tea that has gone cold, listening to the silence. It isn't a scary silence, it's a full silence, a silence that feels like a warm blanket. Think of that lantern now. The flame is very small, a tiny orange heart beating in the center of the stone. It is the only light in the world. The walls of the garden are high, and the sky above is a deep, endless indigo. The man is closing his eyes now. He isn't going to bed. He is just letting himself fade into the garden. He is becoming the moss, the sand, the stone. We are like that garden now. We have stepped down, away from the noise of the 19 parts. We have left the kings and the collectors and the astronomers behind on the surface. We are in the sunken place, the quiet place, where the only thing that matters is the rhythm of your own breathing. The rake has been put away. The sand is still. The plum tree is resting. The lantern is flickering, its oil almost spent. The 19th part is a slow downward spiral into the earth. It is the feeling of cool soil and soft moss. It is the end of the effort of listening. It is the beginning of the long, deep rest. If you are still with me, then we have reached the 20th and final gate. You have traveled through the corridors of history, across the oceans of the Pacific, and into the sunken gardens of the East. You have outlasted the ticking clocks and the rustle of silk. Now we find ourselves in the quietest room of all. We are in a small, circular tower in the French countryside in the year 1580. We are visiting Michel de Montaigne. Montaigne was a man who had seen enough of the world. He had been a lawyer, a courtier, and a mayor, but he decided to retire to his family estate and lock himself in a room filled with 1,000 books. He didn't go there to write a grand history or a political manifesto. He went there to essay himself, to simply sit in the silence and see what thoughts floated to the surface of his mind. Imagine this room. It is high up in a tower, accessible only by a narrow stone staircase. The walls are lined with shelves of old vellum and leather, and the wooden beams of the ceiling are painted with Latin and Greek proverbs about how little humans actually know. One of the inscriptions says, "I do not understand," and another simply asks, "What do I know?" It is a room dedicated to the beauty of not having the answers. Montaigne would spend his days pacing the floor, his hands behind his back, dictating thoughts to a secretary who sat in the corner. He'd talk about the way his cat looked at him, the taste of a certain wine, or why humans are so obsessed with being important when we are all just fragile creatures of flesh and bone. He was the first person to realize that the most interesting story in the world is simply the story of
the story of a mind trying to find peace. As the afternoon sun moves across the floor of the tower, Montaigne grows quiet. He stops pacing. He sits in his high-backed chair and looks out the window at the rolling hills of Périgord. He isn't looking for a king or an army. He's just watching the way the wind moves through the grass. He realizes that the books on his shelves, the wisdom of the Greeks, the tragedies of the Romans, are all just echoes. The real truth is in the stillness of the afternoon. Think of that tower now. The secretary has packed up his ink and parchment and gone home. The stairs are dark. The only sound is the occasional scuttle of a mouse behind the books, or the creak of the old wood as it settles for the night. Montaigne is still in his chair, his head resting against the velvet. He is a man who has stopped asking, "What do I know?" because he has finally learned the value of knowing nothing at all. We are in that tower now. The 20 parts have been our library, and we have read them all. We have turned every page, from the poets to the emperors to the astronomers. But now the books are being closed. The ink is drying on the last sentence of the last essay. The 20 parts have come to a full, heavy stop. There is no part 21. There is no more history to recount. The tower is isolated from the world, and the world has forgotten the tower. You are in the top room, under the painted beams, in the softest chair imaginable. The sun has disappeared behind the hills. The room is a deep, cool blue. Montaigne is a shadow among shadows. The Latin proverbs on the ceiling are invisible now. There is only the feeling of the heavy stone walls protecting you from the noise of the century. The story of the world is finished. The voice has run out of breath. The tower is silent. The dream has begun. Good night.